There is something your body demands of you every single day, something so fundamental that, without it, your mind begins to fracture, and reality itself starts to come apart at the seams. It is not food, it is not water, it is sleep. And throughout history, people have pushed the boundaries of what happens when you deny yourself of it. Sometimes by choice, sometimes by force, and sometimes by circumstances no one can explain. It was a freezing January morning in 1959 when a man in a glass booth in the middle of Times Square decided he was going to stop sleeping. Not for a night, not for 2, but for over 8 straight days. His name was Peter Tripp, and he was one of the most popular radio disc jockeys in New York City. At 32 years old, Tripp was riding high. He hosted a widely listened to Top 40 countdown show on WMGM called Your Hits of the Week, and he had the kind of voice and energy that made listeners feel like they were hanging out with a friend. But Peter Tripp wanted more than ratings. He wanted something spectacular, something that would put him in the history books and raise money for a cause he cared about. So, on January 26, 1959, Peter Tripp climbed into a glass booth that had been erected in Times Square and made a public declaration. He would stay awake for 200 hours straight, broadcasting his radio show each day from inside the booth, all to raise money for the March of Dimes, a charity dedicated to the health of mothers and babies. It was the most ambitious sleep deprivation stunt anyone had ever attempted, and nearly every doctor and psychologist who heard about it warned him not to do it. They told him his body would break down. They told him his mind would crack. They told him the consequences could be permanent. But Tripp brushed them off with the confidence of a man who believed he was invincible. The setup itself was something of a spectacle. The glass booth was positioned right in the heart of Times Square, surrounded by the neon glow of advertisements and the ceaseless traffic of one of the busiest intersections on Earth. Inside, Tripp had access to a microphone, his broadcast equipment, and not much else. A team of researchers, doctors, and nurses rotated shifts to keep watch over him, and a nearby hotel room was available for him to shower and change clothes. The station had contacted sleep researchers specifically because they knew the stunt could be dangerous, and the scientific community saw an opportunity to gather data on something that had never been attempted at this scale before. At first, things went about as well as anyone could have hoped. For the opening hours, Tripp was his usual charismatic self, cracking jokes, entertaining his listeners, and waving at the crowds who gathered around the glass booth to watch him. Visitors came and went, celebrities called in their support, and the money for the March of Dimes began to stack up. The first day slipped by almost uneventfully, and so did most of the second. But somewhere around the 48-hour mark, the cheerfulness began to fade. His body temperature dropped noticeably, a measurable physiological response to the absence of sleep. He became irritable and short-tempered, snapping at the nurses and researchers who were monitoring him. He started cursing at people around him, using language that shocked those who knew him, a stark departure from his typically warm and jovial personality. The man who had been joking with passers-by just hours before was now snarling at anyone who came too close. By the time Tripp had been awake for roughly 100 hours, over 4 full days, things took a darker turn. He could no longer get through simple cognitive tasks. Basic math problems became impossible. Reciting the alphabet, something most children can do effortlessly, was suddenly beyond his grasp. His mind was slowing down in real time, like watching a machine grind to a halt. But the real horror began on the 5th day, when the hallucinations started. At first, they were subtle. Tripp became convinced that there were spiders crawling in his shoes. He stared down at his feet with widening eyes, convinced that he could see them wriggling in and out of the leather. Then he saw mice scurrying around the floor of his booth, darting between his feet. He recoiled from them, swatting at things no one else could see. When he left the booth briefly to shower and change in a nearby hotel room, he opened a chest of drawers to grab fresh clothes and screamed. He told the researchers that he had seen flames shooting out of the open drawer, roaring and crackling, as if the dresser itself were on fire. What happened next was even more disturbing. Tripp began to grow paranoid. He became convinced that the scientists monitoring him were conspiring against him. He believed they were planting evidence and trying to frame him for some unspecified crime. When a researcher dressed in a dark suit approached him during one of these episodes, Tripp looked at the man and saw something else entirely. He believed the man was an undertaker who had come to collect his body. Terrified, Tripp bolted from the booth and ran out into the chaos of Times Square, and the researchers had to chase him down and coax him back inside. The psychologists monitoring Tripp noticed something remarkable and deeply unsettling about his hallucinations. They were not random. They seemed to follow a pattern, cycling roughly every 90 minutes. This timing matched the natural cycle of REM sleep, the phase of sleep when we dream. What the researchers realized was that Tripp's brain, denied the ability to enter sleep, had begun generating dreamlike experiences while he was still fully conscious. His mind was dreaming while he was awake, and the result was a living nightmare that he could not escape because there was no alarm clock to wake him from it. By the final days, Tripp's grip on reality was almost entirely gone. He stared at a clock face and became convinced he could see the face of a friend staring back at him from within it. He began to question who he was. He told the scientists, calmly and with an eerie certainty, that although everyone believed he was Peter Tripp, he was in fact not Peter Tripp at all. He was someone else. He could not explain who, but he insisted that the man everyone thought he was had ceased to exist. For the final 66 hours of the stunt, the doctors gave Tripp stimulant drugs to keep him from collapsing. Without them, they feared he simply could not have continued. When the 201 hours were finally up, on February 4th, 1959, at 9:15 in the morning, Tripp was greeted by a cheering crowd and a marching band. He had done it. He had broken the world record for continuous wakefulness, smashing the previous record of 184 hours. Tripp then slept. Depending on which account you read, he was out for either 13 or 22 straight hours. When he woke, he seemed to have recovered. The hallucinations were gone. He appeared lucid and present. But those closest to him would later say that Peter Tripp was never quite the same. In the weeks and months that followed, a depression settled over him that lasted for more than 3 months. His personality, which had once been warm and magnetic, seemed to have shifted. His marriage fell apart, ending in divorce. His career at WMGM crumbled when, just weeks after his wake-a-thon, he was indicted in the infamous payola scandal of 1960, accused of accepting over $36,000 in bribes from record companies to play their songs on air. He was found guilty and fined $500 with a suspended sentence of 6 months. After that, Tripp drifted. He bounced from station to station, working at KYA in San Francisco, then KGFJ in Los Angeles, and finally WOHO in Toledo, Ohio, never able to recapture the magic or the audience he once had. By 1967, he quit radio entirely. Returning to Los Angeles, he found more success working in physical fitness sales and marketing, eventually diversifying into freelance motivational speaking, writing, and stockbrokering before settling into a quiet retirement in Palm Springs, California. Some who knew him attributed his downfall at least partially to the Wake-a-thon, insisting that something inside him broke during those 8.5 days that never fully healed. Others pointed out that the payola scandal and the personal demons it represented were already eating at him long before he climbed into that glass booth. Perhaps both things were true. Perhaps the sleepless nights simply tore away the walls that were holding everything else back, laying bare all the fractures that had been there all along. The researchers who studied him in the aftermath noted something particularly poignant. Even the paranoia Tripp experienced during the Wake-a-thon seemed to mirror his real life. While hallucinating about scientists conspiring to frame him for a crime, Tripp was, at that very moment, hiding a real criminal secret, the payola bribes that would soon be exposed. His waking nightmares, it turned out, were not entirely fabricated by his sleep-starved brain. They were, at least in part, reflections of anxieties that were already festering beneath the surface. Peter Tripp died on January 31st, 2000, at the age of 73 in Northridge, California, a man whose most famous accomplishment was also the thing that many believe destroyed him. 5 years after Peter Tripp sat trembling in a glass booth in the middle of Times Square, a 17-year-old boy in San Diego, California, decided he could do better. His name was Randy Gardner, and unlike Tripp, he was not a celebrity looking for publicity. He was a high school junior looking for a science fair project. It was December of 1963, and Randy and his two classmates from Point Loma High School, Bruce McAllister and Joe Marciano, were brainstorming ideas for the upcoming 10th annual Greater San Diego Science Fair. They had originally planned to study the effects of sleeplessness on multiple people, but they did not have the equipment for anything that complex. So they simplified. One of them would simply stop sleeping, and the other two would observe and document what happened. Bruce McAllister later recalled that the original plan was for him and Randy to take turns staying awake. But on the very first night, Bruce fell asleep, and Randy was the one still standing. From that point on, it was Randy's experiment. He began on December 28th, 1963, waking up at 6 in the morning with the goal of staying awake continuously until January 8th, 1964. That was 11 days, 264 hours. If he made it, he would shatter the existing record of 260 hours, which was held by a Honolulu DJ named Tom Rounds. For the first couple of days, Randy felt relatively normal. Tired, certainly, but manageable. He described it as feeling like the aftermath of a particularly brutal all-nighter, uncomfortable but survivable. His friends kept him busy with activities to stave off drowsiness. They played basketball, went for walks, listened to loud music, and kept the conversation flowing. But by the third day, things began to change. Randy became moody and irritable. His speech started to slur as if he had been drinking. His coordination deteriorated, and simple physical tasks became clumsy and difficult. Word of Randy's experiment reached a man named William Dement at Stanford University. Dement was a pioneering sleep researcher, a man who would eventually become known as the father of sleep medicine. Born in Wenatchee, Washington in 1928, Dement had been one of the first scientists to study the connection between rapid eye movement and dreaming at the University of Chicago in the 1950s. Along with his mentor Nathaniel Kleitman and fellow researcher Eugene Aserinsky, Dement had helped discover REM sleep, and he was the first to describe and name the 5 stages of the human sleep cycle. He came to Stanford in 1963 to build a sleep research program, and he would go on to found the world's first sleep disorders clinic in 1970. His course at Stanford, called Sleep and Dreams, would become one of the most popular undergraduate courses in the university's history, attended by roughly 20,000 students over the decades. When Dement heard that a teenager in San Diego was attempting to break the sleep deprivation record, he did not just watch from a distance. He recognized an extraordinary scientific opportunity and got on a plane and flew to San Diego to oversee the experiment personally. Dement's arrival was a lifeline for Randy in more ways than one. Not only did his presence transform what had been a high school project into something approaching legitimate science, but his personality and energy gave Randy something new and stimulating to focus on during the most brutal hours of the night. Dement rented a convertible and drove Randy around the city with the radio blasting to keep him awake. They took long walks on the beach at midnight, breathing in the salt air. They played pinball at arcades, shot basketballs at local courts, visited a county jail at 3 a.m. just for something to do, and talked endlessly about anything and everything. Randy later said that Dement's arrival was like a fresh injection of energy that helped carry him through the final stretch. The only substances Randy used to stay awake throughout the entire 11 days were Coca-Cola, loud music, and regular hot and cold showers. No caffeine pills, no stimulant drugs, nothing that would compromise the scientific validity of the experiment. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander John J. Ross from the U.S. Navy Medical Neuropsychiatric Research Unit was also brought in to monitor Randy's health and document the physiological changes as they occurred. By the 4th day, things crossed into genuinely unsettling territory. Randy experienced his first hallucination. He looked at a street sign and saw a person standing there instead. Shortly afterward, he suffered a full delusional episode in which he became convinced that he was Paul Lowe, a famous football player. Randy was a slender teenager, weighing barely 120 pounds. Yet, in that moment, he genuinely believed he was a 200-pound professional athlete. He could not be talked out of it. On the 5th day, more hallucinations crept in. Randy reported seeing a path stretching out from the room in front of him, leading down through a quiet forest. These visions were sometimes described as hypnagogic reveries because Randy, at least after a short while, could usually recognize that what he was seeing was not real. But the recognition came slowly, and during the hallucination itself, the experience felt entirely genuine. His brain was painting pictures on the walls of his waking world. By the 6th and 7th days, Randy's cognitive function had deteriorated dramatically. His speech was slowing down, and he had trouble naming common everyday objects. His memory was shot. He would start a sentence and forget what he was saying before he reached the end. On the 9th day, his thinking became fragmented. He would begin to express a thought, but could not complete it, his mind trailing off into nothingness mid-sentence, leaving behind confused silence. On the 10th day, paranoia set in. Randy became fixated on a radio show host and grew convinced that the man was deliberately trying to humiliate him, making him look foolish because he was struggling to remember details of his ordeal. On the 11th and final day, January 8, 1964, Dr. Ross documented Randy's condition. His face was expressionless. His speech was slurred and monotone. He had to be actively encouraged just to speak at all. His attention span had shrunk to almost nothing, and his mental abilities were severely diminished. When researchers asked him to count backward from 100, subtracting 7 each time, he got to 65 and stopped. When they asked him why he had stopped, he said he had forgotten what he was doing, and yet, in one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire experiment, Randy pulled himself together for the press conference at its conclusion. At 2 a.m. on January 8th, after 264 hours and 24 minutes without sleep, Randy Gardner broke the world record. He spoke to reporters, answered their questions, and by most accounts appeared to be in reasonable health, although those who had been watching him closely over the previous days knew just how thin that veneer of normalcy really was. After the press conference, Randy was taken to a naval hospital where researchers attached electrodes to his head to monitor his brain waves, and he was finally allowed to sleep. He slept for 14 hours and 46 minutes. When he woke up naturally at around 8:40 that evening, he said he felt groggy, but no groggier than a normal person. He went about his business, stayed up until the next evening, and then slept another 10.5 hours. Follow-up sleep recordings taken 1 week, 6 weeks, and 10 weeks after the experiment showed no significant abnormalities. His body had seemingly bounced back from the brink. What was particularly interesting to researchers was the nature of Randy's recovery sleep. They noted significant changes in sleep architecture during the first recovery period. The proportion of time spent in deep, slow-wave sleep and REM sleep was dramatically increased compared to normal, as if his brain was prioritizing the most restorative phases of sleep to repair itself. And yet, he did not need to recover all the sleep he had lost. Out of roughly 88 hours of sleep he would have normally gotten during that 11-day period, he recovered only about 25 hours. His brain, it seemed, was not simply refilling a tank. It was performing triage, repairing the most critical damage first, and letting the rest go. Randy and his friends won first place at the San Diego Science Fair. The record would later be broken by others, including a Finnish man named Toimi Silvo, who stayed awake for 11.5 days, just a month after Randy's attempt. In 1977, Maureen Weston of England reportedly stayed awake for 449 hours during a rocking chair marathon. But in 1997, Guinness World Records stopped accepting attempts in the sleep deprivation category entirely, citing the serious health risks involved. Craig Glenday, the editor-in-chief of Guinness, stated that sleep is a fundamental biological necessity and that challenging the extremes of it was simply too dangerous to encourage. But Randy's experiment remained the most thoroughly documented case of human sleep deprivation in history, and the findings shaped our understanding of what happens when the brain is denied one of its most basic biological needs. But the story did not end there. Decades later, in 2017, Randy Gardner, now in his 70s, revealed something that sent a chill through the sleep research community. He said that about 10 years earlier, around 2007, he had essentially stopped sleeping. He described lying in bed for 5 or 6 hours, sleeping for maybe 15 minutes, and then waking up again. He called himself a basket case. He was awful to be around, he admitted. Everything upset him. It felt, he said, like a continuation of what he had done 50 years earlier. He believed it was karmic payback, his body's way of saying that it remembered what he had done to it all those years ago, punishing him decades later for the arrogance of his youth. Whether or not there is a direct scientific link between his teenage experiment and his adult insomnia remains unclear, and sleep researchers have debated the connection extensively. What is known is that the brain's sleep regulation systems can be altered by extreme disruption, and that there is emerging evidence linking acute sleep deprivation to subsequent chronic insomnia in some individuals. Randy himself was convinced that those 11 sleepless days had come back to haunt him. After years of unbearable insomnia, he eventually made an uneasy peace with sleep. He regained the ability to drift off, but only for about 6 hours a night. He has described sleep, food, and water as what he calls the big three, the three things no human being can do without. William Dement, the man who flew to San Diego to help a teenager stay awake, died in 2020 at the age of 91, reportedly passing away in his sleep. A fittingly peaceful end for the man who spent his life studying the very thing that carried him away. Now, if you spend any time researching the limits of human sleeplessness on the internet, you will almost certainly encounter a story that is far darker and far more extreme than anything Peter Tripp or Randy Gardner experienced. It is known as the Russian sleep experiment, and it describes a secret Soviet-era operation during the late 1940s in which 5 political prisoners were sealed inside a gas chamber and exposed to an experimental stimulant designed to keep them awake for 30 days straight. According to the story, the subjects descended into madness, mutilated themselves, and transformed into something barely recognizable as human. The tale ends with graphic descriptions of self-disembowelment, inhuman strength, and a chilling final line from one of the surviving subjects about the nature of sleep and the horrors that lurk within it. It is a terrifying story, and it has convinced millions of people that such an experiment actually took place. But it did not. The Russian sleep experiment is a work of fiction. It is what the internet calls a creepypasta, which is essentially a horror story designed to be shared and reshared online until the line between fact and fiction becomes deliberately blurred. The story was first posted on August 10th, 2010, by an anonymous user known as Orange Soda on what is now called the Creepypasta Wiki. The accompanying image that is often shared alongside the story, a grotesque, emaciated figure with hollow eyes, is actually a photograph of an animatronic Halloween prop called Spasm. Independent fact-checkers, including Snopes and Bellingcat, have investigated the story and concluded that no declassified Russian archives confirm anything resembling such an experiment. No surviving Soviet personnel have publicly referenced it. The narrative lacks any credible verification whatsoever, and yet, the reason the story continues to spread and continues to be believed is not because of any evidence supporting it, but because the real history of Cold War-era experimentation makes it feel disturbingly plausible. The fictional story itself follows a progression that is almost clinical in its precision. According to the tale, 5 political prisoners deemed enemies of the state were selected and sealed inside a chamber filled with the gas. For the first 5 days, they were relatively calm, though they began speaking about increasingly traumatic memories. After 5 days, severe paranoia set in. The subjects stopped speaking to each other and instead began whispering into the microphones and one-way mirrors, each trying to win the trust of the experimenters by informing on the others. Then came days of screaming, followed by an eerie, prolonged silence. When researchers finally opened the chamber on the 15th day, they found a scene of carnage. One subject was dead. The others had mutilated themselves in ways that defy description, tearing at their own flesh and worse. The survivors reportedly displayed an inhuman resistance to sedation and an unwillingness to be put back to sleep, uttering a final haunting line that has been quoted and misquoted across the internet millions of times. The story works because it borrows from real science and amplifies it to grotesque proportions. We know from documented research that sleep deprivation leads to paranoia. We know it leads to hallucinations. We know it leads to cognitive collapse and a breakdown of the boundaries between self and other, between dream and reality. The Russian sleep experiment simply takes those real symptoms and pushes the slider to its absolute maximum, past the point of scientific plausibility and into the territory of body horror. It is fiction, but it is fiction built on a foundation of uncomfortable truth. Both the Soviet Union and the United States conducted secretive and ethically horrifying experiments on human subjects during the 20th century. The Soviet government was known to engage in brutal psychiatric experiments to control political dissidents and test forms of psychological warfare. Political prisoners in the Gulag system were subjected to conditions designed to break them physically and mentally. The United States had its own dark legacy, including the infamous MK-Ultra program run by the CIA, which involved experiments with LSD, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation on unwitting subjects, sometimes with devastating and permanent consequences. In this context, the Russian sleep experiment does not need to be true to carry weight. It taps into a very real history of governments treating human beings as expendable test subjects, and it amplifies that reality through the lens of horror fiction. What makes the story so psychologically effective is that the real, documented effects of sleep deprivation are themselves so disturbing that the fictional account does not feel like that much of a stretch. We know from the cases of Peter Tripp and Randy Gardner that extended wakefulness leads to hallucinations, paranoia, cognitive collapse, and a fundamental fracturing of the mind's ability to distinguish reality from delusion. The Russian sleep experiment simply asks the question, what if you push that even further? What if there were no limits, no ethics review boards, no one watching? And that question resonates because history has shown us, time and again, that such cruelty is not fiction. It is just dressed differently. Speaking of people who lived in defiance of what science tells us the body requires, there are cases scattered throughout history that seem to defy everything we understand about the biological necessity of sleep. One of the most enduring and puzzling of these cases is that of a man named Al Herpin, a recluse from Trenton, New Jersey, who became nationally famous in the early 20th century for a single extraordinary claim. He said he had never slept. Al Herpin was born on January 1st, 1862, in Paris, France, and immigrated to the United States at a young age. He settled in Trenton, New Jersey, where he would spend the rest of his extraordinarily long life. For over 15 years, he worked as a hostler, a person who takes care of horses, in the employ of a local official named Walter Ferris. He later drifted into a series of odd jobs, working as a street sweeper, a delivery driver, a pottery decorator, where he reportedly developed innovative techniques for printing photographs beneath the glaze of pottery, and various other positions around the city. He was by all accounts a quiet and reclusive man who kept to himself and showed little interest in the attention that would eventually come to define his public identity. He lived alone in a ramshackle shack at 512 May Avenue in Ewing, on the outskirts of Trenton, and inside that shack, there was one conspicuous absence. There was no bed. There were no sheets, no blankets, no pillows, nothing to suggest that sleep had ever taken place there. The only furnishings of note were a small stove, a dresser, and a rocking chair. In its place was a rocking chair. Herpin told anyone who would listen that after a long day of work, he would sit in his rocking chair, read the newspaper, and remain awake through the night until dawn, when he would rise and begin working again. He said he had not slept in decades. The story first gained national attention in February of 1904, when the New York Times published an article about him under the headline about a hostler who had not slept in 10 years. The article described him as being in perfect health and showing no discomfort from his condition. Over the following years, the story only grew. By some accounts, local physicians examined Herpin over a period of 7 days and were unable to catch him sleeping. According to a separate report, the publisher, Joseph Pulitzer, who ran the New York World, sent his own team of doctors to observe Herpin, and they too came away baffled after a week of observation. Herpin turned down an offer of $10,000 from a scientific organization in Vienna to undergo testing. Marriage proposals poured in from across the country, all of which he declined. There were varying accounts of how his sleeplessness began. Some reports attributed it to the death of his wife in 1882, saying that the shock and grief had permanently destroyed his ability to sleep. Others suggested that the condition dated back to his birth, with one story claiming that his mother had been in a carriage accident while pregnant and that he had never slept normally from the beginning. Herpin himself was quoted as saying that the problem started around the birth of his son and that the nervousness never subsided. Al Herpin became a local legend and a national curiosity, appearing in Ripley's Believe It or Not and drawing visitors to his modest shack from far and wide. He lived to the age of 94, dying on January 3, 1947. His obituary in the New York Times noted that he had insisted his entire life that he never actually slept, maintaining that he merely rested. Whether or not this was literally true remains an open question. Modern sleep science tells us that all humans require sleep, and that individuals who believe they never sleep are almost certainly experiencing something called microsleeps, brief, involuntary episodes of sleep lasting anywhere from a few seconds to about 15 seconds. During a microsleep, the brain briefly enters a sleep state even if the person's eyes remain open, and the individual may have no awareness that it occurred. Thousands of miles away, on the other side of the world, another man would make a strikingly similar claim more than a half-century later. His name is Thai Ngoc, and he is a farmer from the Quang Nam province of Vietnam. According to Ngoc, he has not slept since 1973, the year he came down with a severe fever. He says that when the fever broke, his ability to sleep simply vanished and never returned. Despite trying medications, traditional folk remedies, and even generous amounts of alcohol, nothing has been able to bring back the Sandman. What makes Ngoc's case so bewildering is that by all outward appearances, his lack of sleep has not destroyed him. He lives an active life on his farm in the Nha Trang Valley, tending to his crops, raising fish in his pond, and performing physical labor that would tire a man half his age. He has been quoted as saying he can carry 50 kilograms of fertilizer over a distance of 4 kilometers from his house to his fields without feeling tired. His family and neighbors all insist that they have never seen him sleep. When night falls and the rest of the village retreats indoors, Ngoc keeps working, tilling soil by moonlight, crafting his homemade rice wine, and doing whatever else needs to be done. He described his nightly routine with a mixture of resignation and quiet frustration, saying that on moonlit nights, he usually goes out to weed and till the soil because sitting still is unbearable for him. He expressed envy for those who can close their eyes and drift away, acknowledging the strangeness of working twice as much as everyone else, and yet never feeling prosperous for it. Ngoc's story first gained international attention in 2007 when Vietnamese news outlets ran features on him. Foreign television networks offered substantial sums of money to document his life, but he refused the invitations. Ngoc, who has not left his village in over 60 years, was not interested in becoming a spectacle. He just wanted someone to explain why his body refuses to do what every other human body on Earth does without a second thought. In February of 2023, YouTuber Drew Binsky visited Ngoc and spent a night observing him. Binsky noted that Ngoc went through the motions of attempting to sleep, even wearing pajamas and lying in bed around 4 in the morning. But he was unable to fall asleep and eventually got back up, returning to his endless cycle of nighttime labor. Doctors who have examined Ngoc have found him to be in surprisingly good health, which only deepens the mystery. One theory is that his sleeplessness may be related to post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from injuries he suffered during the Vietnam War, during which he reportedly injured his hand. Another possibility is that some unknown neurological event during his 1973 fever altered the sleep centers of his brain in a way that modern medicine cannot yet explain. But no definitive medical explanation has ever been provided, and Ngoc himself has said he does not know whether his insomnia has impacted his health or not, noting simply that he is still healthy and can farm normally like others. Like Herpin, Ngoc has never agreed to undergo comprehensive monitoring by sleep scientists, which means that the possibility of microsleeps, those brief involuntary episodes of sleep lasting from a few seconds to about 15 seconds, remains very real. During a microsleep, the brain briefly enters a sleep state even if the person's eyes remain open, and the individual may have no awareness that it occurred. Some experts, including Dr. Vikas Wadhwa of Sleep Services Australia, have suggested that people with severe insomnia like Ngoc may simply lack the ability to tell the difference between being awake and being asleep, and that his brain could be obtaining necessary rest in brief, undetectable bursts throughout the day without his awareness. This phenomenon would explain how both Herpin and Ngoc survived for decades while claiming total sleeplessness, because their brains were sleeping, just not in any way they could perceive. Whether Herpin and Ngoc truly defied the biological imperative of sleep, or whether their brains found secret ways to rest without their knowledge, may never be fully answered. But their stories stand as enduring reminders that sleep, and the lack of it, continues to puzzle even the most advanced minds in medicine. The longest scientifically documented period of complete wakefulness remains Randy Gardner's 11 days, and that was enough to produce hallucinations, paranoia, and cognitive collapse. The idea that someone could go decades without sleeping at all stretches scientific credibility to its breaking point, and yet these men lived their lives insisting on exactly that claim, and no one was ever able to definitively prove them wrong. Unfortunately, the intersection of sleep deprivation and human cruelty did not remain in the realm of folklore and internet fiction. In the years following the September 11th, 2001 attacks, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States developed and implemented a systematic program of what it called enhanced interrogation techniques at a network of secret overseas detention facilities known as black sites. Among the many methods employed, sleep deprivation was one of the most commonly used and one of the most devastating. According to a May 2005 memorandum from the Office of Legal Counsel to the CIA's Senior Deputy General Counsel, sleep deprivation was formally defined as subjecting a detainee to an extended period of sleeplessness in order to weaken their resistance. The memorandum stated that up to 180 hours of continuous sleep deprivation, that is 7.5 straight days, was permitted with authorization. To put that into perspective, Peter Tripp was hallucinating and running from imaginary undertakers after 5 days. Randy Gardner was experiencing paranoid delusions and complete cognitive fragmentation after just over a week, and the CIA was authorized to push detainees past 7 days. The methods used to enforce sleeplessness were systematic and brutal. Detainees were typically shackled in a standing position, their hands sometimes chained above their heads and attached to the ceiling, forcing them to remain upright for days at a time. If they attempted to sit or crouch, the shackles would pull painfully against their wrists. They were placed in diaper-like garments because they were not allowed to use a bathroom on their own schedule. They were stripped naked, or nearly so, exposed to cold temperatures, and subjected to constant bright lights and deafening music to prevent any possibility of drifting off. The 2014 report by the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, commonly known as the Senate Torture Report, documented the scope and severity of the CIA's detention and interrogation program in horrifying detail. The report, which was based on a 5-year investigation and ran more than 6,700 pages with over 38,000 footnotes, revealed that the CIA had kept some prisoners awake for over 180 hours. The report stated that at least 5 detainees experienced disturbing hallucinations during prolonged sleep deprivation, and that in at least 2 of those cases, the CIA continued the sleep deprivation even after the hallucinations began. One of the most extensively documented cases was that of Abu Zubaydah, who was the CIA's first significant detainee captured after the September 11th attacks. Zubaydah was held by the agency for approximately 1,590 days and was subjected to an array of techniques, including standing sleep deprivation, being confined in coffin-sized boxes for up to 266 hours, and being waterboarded 83 times. In testimony that was later declassified, Zubaydah described being shackled completely, unable to move, with water poured over cloth on his face repeatedly. The program was designed and overseen by 2 contract psychologists, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, who were former supervisors of the U.S. Air Force's SEER program, which stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. SEER was originally developed to train pilots and soldiers on how to resist brainwashing techniques, the same techniques that were believed to have been used by the Chinese to extract false confessions during the Korean War. Mitchell and Jessen reversed the program's purpose, transforming it from a tool of defense into a weapon of offense. They were paid $81 million for their services before the contract was terminated in 2009, out of an original agreement worth over $180 million. The Senate report concluded that the techniques were not only brutal, but also ineffective. It found that the CIA had routinely conducted what it called brutal interrogations and had repeatedly misled federal officials and the public about both the existence and the effectiveness of the program. The report stated that the CIA itself had determined from its own experience with coercive interrogations, even before September 11th, that such techniques do not produce intelligence and will probably result in false answers. At a black site in Afghanistan codenamed Cobalt, but also known as the Salt Pit, 4 cells were specifically designed for sleep deprivation, with high bars to which prisoners could be secured. A memo about the death of a detainee named Gul Rahman, sent to the Deputy Director of Operations in January 2003, described the routine use of diapers, sleep deprivation, and cold showers. Rahman was described as being resolutely defiant, which led to a decision to use enhanced interrogation. The night he was last seen alive, he was shackled with his hands and feet bound, naked from the waist down. When guards checked on him hours later, he was observed alive and shaking, his eyes open and blinking. He died before morning from suspected hypothermia. The International Committee of the Red Cross conducted interviews with 14 high-value detainees after their transfer to Guantanamo Bay. 11 of the 14 alleged that they had been subjected to sleep deprivation through various means, including days of constant interrogation, forced stress positions, dousing in cold water, and exposure to constant noise and music. Some described 7 continuous days without sleep. Others described intermittent deprivation that stretched over 2 to 3 months. One detainee described being exposed to loud music for 20 consecutive days. Beyond the CIA's black sites, sleep deprivation was also systematically employed at Guantanamo Bay itself. There, it took a different form through a program known as the Frequent Flyer Program, a deliberately designed system in which detainees were constantly and methodically moved between cells in order to disrupt their sleep. Just as a detainee would begin to drift off, guards would arrive, shackle him, and move him to another cell. The process would repeat throughout the night and into the next day, creating a state of perpetual disorientation in which rest became impossible. It was not the dramatic, violent imagery of chaining someone to a ceiling, but the effect was the same. The slow, grinding destruction of a person's mental and physical resilience through the systematic denial of one of the body's most fundamental needs. The medical professionals involved in the program filled several disturbing roles. Some cleared detainees as medically fit for the techniques. Others monitored the torture sessions to prevent death, essentially serving as safety officers for practices that were deliberately designed to inflict suffering. Some were involved in developing new methods of coercion, and some, according to the Senate report, participated directly in the interrogations themselves. All of these actions were taken after CIA and Department of Justice attorneys provided assurances of legal immunity, promising the medical professionals that they would not be held responsible for violating U.S. and international law as long as they followed the approved guidelines. The American Psychological Association was later investigated for its role in providing ethical cover for these practices, and in 2015, an independent review found that key figures within the organization had collaborated with the Defense Department and CIA to ensure that the APA's ethical guidelines did not prevent psychologists from participating in interrogations. In 2009, President Barack Obama signed an executive order ending the program. The Senate Intelligence Committee published the declassified summary of its report in December of 2014. Obama called it a troubling program and affirmed that such methods would not be used again. The European Court of Human Rights confirmed the existence of CIA black sites in 2014, finding that Poland had allowed the CIA to detain and torture suspects on its soil. Later that year, the Polish government acknowledged the truth of these findings. But for the men who endured those sleepless days and nights in windowless cells, chained to ceilings and subjected to the kind of suffering that Peter Tripp and Randy Gardner experienced voluntarily, but amplified through force, coercion, and deliberate cruelty, the damage had already been done. The techniques that one teenager from San Diego endured for a science fair project, and that one radio DJ endured for a charity stunt, were being wielded as weapons by the most powerful intelligence agency in the world, against people who had no choice and no way out. The question of what sleep deprivation can ultimately do to a human being, if pushed far enough, finds its most terrifying answer not in experiments or interrogation rooms, but in a disease so rare and so merciless that it almost defies belief. It is called fatal familial insomnia, and it is exactly what the name suggests: an inherited neurological condition that progressively and irreversibly destroys the brain's ability to sleep, and it is always, without exception, fatal. Fatal familial insomnia is caused by a mutation in a gene known as PRNP, which produces a protein called prion protein. In people with the mutation, this protein misfolds, becoming toxic and accumulating in a specific region of the brain called the thalamus, a structure that acts as the master switch for sleep and wakefulness, body temperature, appetite, and many other essential functions. As the misfolded prions build up, they destroy the thalamus from the inside, and the person's ability to sleep deteriorates progressively and unstoppably. It is an autosomal dominant condition, meaning that if one of your parents carries the mutation, you have a 50% chance of inheriting it, and if you inherit it, you will develop the disease. There is no escaping it. There is no preventing it. Genetic testing can tell you whether you carry the mutation before symptoms appear, but it cannot change the outcome. The disease was first described in 1986 by Italian neurologist Elio Lugaresi and his colleagues, based on the case of an Italian man known in the medical literature as Silvano, who presented with rapidly worsening insomnia, profuse sweating, a racing heart, and progressive mental deterioration. A local physician named Dr. Ignazio Reuter had noticed a pattern of unexplained deaths in Silvano's family, stretching back through generations. Family members had died one by one, each succumbing to a mysterious illness that always began with the inability to sleep and always ended in death. When Silvano himself began to show symptoms, Reuter referred his case to Lugaresi, who was a well-known sleep expert. With Silvano's family cooperating in the investigation, the researchers were able to trace the disease through their genealogy, ultimately identifying a pedigree of 288 members across 6 generations, with 29 members either confirmed or suspected to have been affected. Silvano himself deteriorated quickly. Within months of the first symptoms, he was unable to sleep at all. His condition progressed through stages of escalating horror, first insomnia, then hallucinations, then panic attacks and involuntary physical responses, then complete cognitive disintegration, and finally, coma and death, all of it playing out over the course of roughly a year and a half. The condition typically begins between the ages of 20 and 70, with an average onset around 40. Life expectancy after symptoms begin ranges from 7 months to 6 years, with an average of about 18 months. The range depends partly on the specific genetic profile of the individual, with some variations of the mutation leading to faster or slower progression. The progression is nightmarish. In the early stages, the person notices difficulty falling asleep. This quickly escalates into severe insomnia that does not respond to any medication. Sleeping pills, sedatives, even powerful barbiturates have no effect. As the insomnia deepens, the person begins to experience hallucinations, panic attacks, and wild fluctuations in blood pressure and heart rate. Their autonomic nervous system spirals out of control. They sweat profusely. They develop involuntary muscle twitches and jerks. Their cognitive abilities collapse. They enter a state of perpetual waking delirium, trapped in a twilight zone between consciousness and unconsciousness, unable to truly sleep and unable to truly be awake. Eventually, they slip into a coma and die. There are roughly 50 known families in the world that carry the mutation. Sporadic cases, occurring in people without the genetic mutation, have also been documented, though they are rarer still, with only about 30 cases ever recorded. There is no cure. There is no effective treatment. There are only palliative measures to try to make the person as comfortable as possible during their final months of unimaginable suffering. Fatal familial insomnia serves as the most extreme and tragic demonstration of a truth that science is only beginning to fully appreciate. Sleep is not optional. It is not a luxury. It is not something to be proud of sacrificing. It is as essential to survival as breathing, and when it is taken away, whether by choice, by force, by disease, or by circumstance, the consequences are devastating. We live in a culture that celebrates sleeplessness, that rewards the person who can get by on 4 hours a night, that glorifies the hustle and dismisses rest as laziness. But the science tells a different story. Even modest sleep deprivation, the kind millions of people experience every single night, is linked to heart disease, depression, weight gain, impaired immune function, increased risk of stroke, and a host of cognitive impairments that accumulate silently over time. Neuroscientist Matthew Walker of UC Berkeley has pointed to one of the largest sleep experiments ever conducted, one that happens every year to 1.6 billion people across the globe. It is called daylight saving time. In the spring, when clocks move forward and people lose a single hour of sleep, hospitals see a measurable spike in heart attacks the following day. In the autumn, when clocks fall back and people gain an hour, the rate drops. 1 hour. That is all it takes for the effect to be visible at a population level. Now imagine what 11 days does. Imagine what 7.5 days of forced wakefulness in a standing position with your hands chained above your head does. Imagine what a lifetime without sleep would do if it were truly possible. From a glass booth in Times Square where a radio DJ watched spiders crawl out of his shoes, to a teenager's bedroom in San Diego where a 17-year-old saw a painted road stretching through a forest that was not there, from anonymous stories shared on the darkest corners of the internet where fiction and real science merge into something inescapably unsettling, to a rocking chair in a shack in New Jersey where an old man read his newspaper through the long dark hours and insisted he had never closed his eyes, from the rice paddies of Vietnam where a farmer works under the moonlight because sitting still is unbearable, to the cells of CIA black sites where detainees were shackled to ceilings and denied the basic mercy of rest, to the hospital beds of patients with a death sentence written into their DNA who watch helplessly as their ability to sleep slips away forever. The story of sleep deprivation is ultimately a story about the fragile machinery of the human mind and how easily it can be broken. We spend roughly a third of our lives asleep, and for most of us, that time feels wasted, unproductive, forgettable. We resent it. We try to minimize it. We scroll through our phones at midnight, telling ourselves we will sleep in just a few more minutes. But the people in these stories, the ones who lost sleep voluntarily, and the ones who had it stolen from them, the ones whose bodies refuse to let them rest, and the ones whose genes have sentenced them to wakefulness until it kills them, they know something the rest of us take for granted every time we close our eyes and drift off. They know that sleep is not just rest. It is the thing that holds us together, and without it, piece by piece, we come undone. If you found this exploration of the dark side of sleeplessness as fascinating and unsettling as I did, consider subscribing to the channel and dropping a like on the video. It really does help more than you might think, and it ensures that we can keep bringing you these deep dives into the strangest and most disturbing corners of human experience. Until next time, sleep well, and I mean that more sincerely than you know.